Every year, we celebrate independence with fire, family, and freedom. But do you know what happened here 250 years ago today? Before, there was America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of We the Podcast. Thank you for joining me as we celebrate 250 years of American independence. This episode means a lot to me because I love this country very deeply, and we have been blessed with great fortune to have been born in the land of liberty and to have an opportunity to see the 250th anniversary of this great nation. This is the only nation on the planet that was founded on the principles of liberty. I love the principles behind the United States. That our rights come from God. That government exists to protect liberty. That power must be restrained. And that the people are not subjects to be ruled, but citizens of a republic entrusted with self-government. That is why Independence Day has always meant more to me than fireworks and celebration. It is a day of gratitude. It is a day of remembrance. This being our 250th anniversary of independence, I wanted to do something special for it. Before we talk about the cost of independence, we need to remember why the colonies reached that point in the first place. Because the American Revolution did not begin with independence. It began with resistance, peaceful resistance at that. For many years, the colonists saw themselves as British subjects. They were not originally trying to break away and create a new nation. They were trying to defend rights that they believed already belonged to them. The rights of Englishmen, the rights of representation, the rights of trial by jury, the right of self-government, and the right not to be ruled by a distant power without their consent or representation. That is what made the conflict grow so dangerous over time. After the French and Indian War, Britain was left with massive debt. Parliament began looking to the colonies as a way to raise revenue. And from the British perspective, that may have seemed reasonable. Britain had spent heavily defending its empire, and the colonies were a part of that empire. But from the colonial perspective, something much deeper was happening. The issue was whether a government across the ocean, where the colonies had no direct representation, could reach into their lives, tax them, regulate them, punish them, and even override their local government without their consent. That was the heart of the matter. In 1765 came the Stamp Act. It placed taxes on printed materials throughout the colonies. That meant newspapers, legal documents, licenses, pamphlets, and more. The colonists pushed back hard because they understood the precedent. If Parliament could tax them internally without consent once, then what was the limit? Then came the Declaratory Act, where Parliament claimed the authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That phrase matters. All cases whatsoever. That is the opposite of the government that we have today, or at least the government we should have today, but that's not the topic. That was not limited government. That was unlimited claim. Then came the Townshend Acts. More taxes, more tension, and more resentment from the colonies. British troops were stationed in Boston. The relationship between the people and the soldiers grew bitter. By 1770, that tension exploded in the Boston Massacre when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Then came the Tea Act. Then came the Boston Tea Party. Then Britain responded with force. Parliament passed what the British called the Coercive Acts, but what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts' charter was altered. Local self-government was placed under direct pressure. The message was clear. Resist Parliament, and Parliament will punish you. And this is where something changed. The punishment of Massachusetts did not simply isolate Massachusetts. It helped unite the colonies. People in other colonies looked at what Britain was doing to Boston and understood that if the rights of one colony could be crushed, the rights of every colony were at risk. That is how resistance turned into unity. In the First Continental Congress met in 1774, the colonies were still trying to find a way to resolve this crisis peacefully, but relationships were breaking. Trust was disappearing. Britain wanted nothing but obedience, and colonies wanted nothing but their rights to be secured. And then came April 19th, 1775. Lexington and Concord. The shot heard around the world. British troops marched to seize colonial military supplies. Local militia stood in their way. Shots were fired, men died, the war began. That day changed everything. Before Lexington and Concord, there was still hope that the crisis could be handled politically. After Lexington and Concord, the colonies were no longer dealing with theory. Blood had been spilled. Armed men were in the field. The question was no longer whether tensions were rising. The question was whether the colonies would submit or fight. And even then, independence was not automatic. That is one of the most important parts of this story. Even after Lexington and Concord, even after blood had been shed, many still hoped there would be reconciliation. In July of 1975, Congress sent an olive branch petition to King George III. They were still appealing to the king. They were still trying to avoid a full break. They were still trying, in effect, to restore our rights, and this can be healed. But King George did not receive that moment as a path to peace. He declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. At that point, the door to reconciliation was closing fast. The colonists had petitioned, protested, boycotted, and pleaded. They had argued as British subjects for the rights that they believed were theirs. And now they were being told that their resistance was rebellion. By 1776, the choice had become painfully clear. They could submit to a government that they believed had violated their rights, or they could separate. And separation meant war. Separation meant danger. Separation meant their property could be taken, their families could suffer, their names could be marked forever, and their lives could be placed at risk. This is why the Declaration of Independence was not a sudden, reckless, and emotional outburst. It was the result of years of failed appeals, repeated violations, and a growing belief that liberty could no longer be secured under the crown. The declaration was that the United Colonies, standing their ground against a king that refused to hear their petitions and pleas. That is what makes July 4th so powerful. It was not the beginning of a struggle. It was the moment that the struggle received its name, independence. And once that word was spoken, once it was written, once it was declared to the world, there was no easy road back. The colonies had crossed a line. Everyone who signed their name to that piece of paper signed their own death sentence for treason. After we say Independence Day, it's easy to picture the end story. We picture the Betsy Ross flag. We picture fireworks. We picture the Declaration of Independence. We picture Paul Revere, his infamous horse ride. We picture defiance and treason in the name of liberty. The men who fought the revolution did not know there would be a United States 250 years later. They did not know George Washington would become the first president. They did not know that the Constitution would one day be written, or that the new nation would survive long enough for us to sit here today to celebrate its birthday. All they knew was that the most powerful empire on earth was standing against them. Great Britain had a professional army. It had the greatest navy in the world. It had money, ships, discipline, experience, and global reach and resources unlike any other nation in the history of the world. The colonies had courage. But courage does not feed an army. Courage does not make shoes appear in the snow. Courage does not stop disease from spreading through a camp. Courage does not pay soldiers who have families waiting at home. And that is what makes this revolution so extraordinary. It was not fought by famous men whose portraits hang in museums. It was fought by farmers, tradesmen, laborers, blacksmiths, sailors, fathers, sons, teenagers, all who stepped into a war without any guarantee that the cause would survive. The cost was brutal. An estimated 6,800 Americans were killed in action during the Revolutionary War. About 6,100 were wounded. More than 20,000 were taken prisoner. And at least another 17,000 died of disease or starvation. That number matters because it reminds us that many of them that died did not die in a heroic charge across the battlefield. They died sick. They died hungry. They died in prison ships. They died in camps. They died of infections, exposure, typhus, typhoid, dysentery, influenza, smallpox, and starvation. Some died far from their homes without their mothers, their wives, children, or brothers beside them. And for the men who survived, survival did not always mean they came home whole. Some came home to debt, Some came home to farms that had been destroyed, to families that had barely survived or did not survive without them. Some came home with government promises of payment that were worth less and less as the war dragged on. The Continental Army struggled constantly with supplies and finances. There were struggles of food, clothing, arms, ammunition, tents, blankets, shoes, and basic equipment. At times, soldiers were underfed, underpaid, and underclothed. They were asked to keep fighting for a nation that could not provide for them. That is one of the hardest things to sit with. These men were not fighting for a country that already had the power to protect them. They were fighting to create that country. They were suffering for a nation that had not yet stable finances, a strong central government, or a secure future. And still, they stayed. Not all of them. Some deserted. Some went home when enlistments expired. Some could not endure it. That is the honest truth. The army was fragile. Washington had to hold it together again and again. The revolution nearly collapsed more than once. And still, they stayed. They endured. They kept marching. At Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 into 1778, Washington's army faced one of the greatest tests. The popular image is men freezing in the snow, and there is truth in the suffering. But the deeper story is even more powerful. Valley Forge was not just about cold. It was about whether the army could survive as an army at all. There were supply failures. Men lacked proper clothing. Disease spread. Food was short. Morale was tested. Families who followed the army suffered beside the army. And yet, out of all of that misery, the Continental Army became more disciplined, more organized, and more capable. That is the miracle of it. They did not win independence because everything went correctly. They won it while almost everything was going wrong. They lost New York. They retreated across New Jersey. They watched the British occupy major cities. They suffered through disease. They fought through shortages. They struggled to keep soldiers enlisted. They relied on paper money that collapsed in value. They saw friends get captured. They saw men die in prison ships so terrible that thousands of American prisoners never came home. And still somehow the cause survived. When we talk about the American Revolution, we sometimes make it sound clean because we know the ending. We know there is a declaration. We know there is George Washington. We know there's a republic. They did not know any of that. They were living through fear, hunger, grief, uncertainty, and sacrifice. Before independence was won, it had to be endured. Before America could celebrate, it had to survive. And that brings us to the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. 56 men placed their names on that document. Today, those names are honored. Those signatures are preserved. Today, we look at them as founding fathers. But in 1776, those signatures were dangerous. They were not signing from the safety of victory. They were signing while British armies were still on the field. They signed while the outcome was unknown. and they were signing while the punishment for treason still hung over their heads. If the American Revolution failed, those names would not be remembered as names of founders. They would be remembered as names of traitors. That is the weight of that moment. And I want to try and carefully honor them here, because there are a lot of stories told about the signers of the Declaration. Some of them are true. Some of them are exaggerated. Some of them get repeated every 4th of July because they sound powerful, even when the details are not solid. But we don't need to exaggerate. The truth is powerful enough. Of the 56 signers, more than half of them suffered physical harm, imprisonment, property destruction, or other penalties during the course of the revolution. 15 had their homes destroyed. Several were captured or imprisoned. Some had property seized, looted, occupied, or burned. Some lost their entire fortunes. Some had their families killed or separated. Some died before they ever saw the nation fully secured. And all of them understood that their signatures carried the risk of death if the revolution failed. So before we wrap up this episode, I want to honor those who sacrificed so much. Not all 56, but the names of those that we can point to and say this man paid a terrible price. First, you have Josiah Bartlett out of New Hampshire. Before independence was even declared, local supporters of the crown burned his home. He rebuilt and continued the cause, and later became the second man to sign the Declaration after John Hancock. William Ellery, out of Rhode Island. During the British occupation of Newport, his house was burned and his property was badly damaged. He signed knowing what it could cost, and the war brought the cost directly to his door. William Floyd. A few weeks after the Declaration was signed, the British forces took control of Long Island. Floyd's house and farm were confiscated. His wife and children fled to Connecticut, and his estate remained in British hands for years. Philip Livingston of New York. British forces took over his Brooklyn estate. He fled with his family. He continued serving the cause and died in 1778 while Congress was meeting in York, Pennsylvania. He never lived to see independence fully secured. Francis Lewis of New York. His home in Queens was attacked and ransacked. His books, papers, and furniture were destroyed. His wife Elizabeth was arrested and imprisoned by the British. She was later exchanged, but her health was ruined, and she died in 1779. Lewis Morris of New York. His estate was left in ruin by British invasion of New York. Fields and crops were destroyed. The manor house was looted. Fences were burned. Livestock was slaughtered or driven away. After the war, he spent years trying to rebuild what had been taken from him. Richard Stockton of New Jersey. Stockton was captured and dragged from his bed, put in irons, and treated as a criminal. After weeks in prison, he was released on parole, with his health ruined. When he returned home, he found his estate plundered, his property taken, and much of what he had built destroyed. John Hart of New Jersey. Hart was forced to flee his home and hide from British forces. His farm was raided, his property was damaged, his family suffered deeply. His wife passed away during the hardships of the war, and he returned to a life that had been broken by the conflict. Abraham Clark of New Jersey. Clark suffered through his sons. Two of his sons were captured and imprisoned by the British. Accounts say that one was treated so extremely cruelly that he nearly starved to death. John Witherspoon of New Jersey. Witherspoon was the only active clergyman to sign the Declaration. His son James joined the Continental Army and was killed in the Battle of Germantown in 1777. Witherspoon signed as a public man, but he paid as a father. George Clymer of Pennsylvania. Clymer was forced to flee and suffered loss of property during the war. He would later go on to become one of the few men to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But his commitment to independence brought danger and loss to his own household. Lyman Hall of Georgia. When British forces overran Georgia, Hall was forced to flee his estate. His house and plantation were burned, and he suffered major financial loss. He did not return safely to Georgia until after the British withdrew. George Walton of Georgia. Walton served in the Georgia militia. During the British attack on Savannah, he was wounded, fell from his horse, and taken prisoner. He was later freed in a prison exchange, but his body and his liberties both bore the price of the cause. Arthur Middleton of South Carolina. Middleton's estate was destroyed, like many others, by the British campaign in South Carolina. The British forces took what they could and destroyed what they could not carry. When Charleston fell, Middleton was captured and imprisoned in St. Augustine, Florida, for almost a year. Thomas Hayward Jr. of South Carolina. Hayward was captured after Charleston fell as well. He was also taken to St. Augustine and held prisoner for 11 months. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina. Rutledge was one of the youngest signers of the Declaration. He was also captured after the fall of Charleston and imprisoned in St. Augustine, and his property was all seized and destroyed. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia. Nelson used his own fortune to support the Patriot cause and organize Virginia militia. He was never fully reimbursed. His wartime sacrifices ruined him financially, and his Yorktown home was damaged during the war. He pledged his fortune, and he followed through with it. Carter Braxton of Virginia. Braxton invested heavily in the Revolution. He loaned money to the cause and helped fund shipping and privateering. The British destroyed many of his ships and ravaged several of his plantations and land holdings. He accumulated heavy debt and was forced to leave his estate. And then there are signers whose stories are tragic, even when the tragedy was not simply as British retaliation. Thomas Lynch Jr. of South Carolina. He was young, sick, and already weakened by illness when he served in Congress. His father, who had served the Patriot cause, died on the journey home in 1779. Thomas Lynch Jr. and his wife sailed in search of better health and were lost at sea. He was only 30 years old and never got to see the end of the war. Thomas Stone of Maryland. Stone was a quieter man, cautious by temperament, but when the time came, he signed. His beloved wife Margaret later died of a long illness, and Stone, grief-stricken, died only a few months later. His story reminds us that not every wound of the founding generation was made by a musket. Some were made by grief. These are the names that we should remember. Together, they show us what the final line of the Declaration really meant. Their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Many sacrificed everything they had for this great nation that we have today. And for all 56, it was the knowledge that if America failed, their signatures could lead them to the gallows. So when we look at the Declaration, we should not just see old ink and parchment paper. We should see courage. We should see sacrifice. We should see men who had everything to lose and signed anyway. That is the price behind the names. And 50 years later, the nation had reached its first great milestone of July 4th, 1826. The 50th anniversary of American independence. Think about what that meant. 50 years earlier, the United States was only an idea on parchment. It was fragile. It was poor. It was divided. It was outmatched. It was surrounded by uncertainty. No one knew whether the Declaration would become the birth certificate of a nation or evidence of a treason trial. But by 1826, America had survived. The Revolution had been won. The Constitution had been written. The Republic had been formed, and the presidency had passed peacefully from one man to another. The nation had even expanded. It has been moving westward. A generation had been born that had never known life under the crown. And two of the greatest men of the founding generation were still alive to see it. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Two men who helped bring this country into existence. Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. Adams, one of the independence's fiercest advocates in Congress. They were both members of the committee chosen to draft the Declaration. They both served the cause during the Revolution. They both represented America abroad. They both became presidents of the United States. And in their own ways, they both helped shape the republic that came after independence. They were not always friends. And that is part of what makes their stories so human. They had been allies in the cause of independence. Then they became political rivals. Their friendship fractured during the bitter politics of the early republic. For years, the two men were divided by party, philosophy, and distrust. But near the end of their lives, they had reconciled. They began writing to each other once again. And through those letters, you can almost hear the old revolution speaking to itself. Two aging founders looking back across decades of triumph, failure, struggle, conflict, pride, regret, and hope. They had seen the Declaration become more than words. They had seen the revolution become a country. And they had seen that country become a republic. And now, as the 50th anniversary approached, both men understood the meaning of that day. Jefferson was invited to attend the celebration in Washington, D.C., but he was too sick to go. Instead, he wrote what became his final public letter. And in that letter, Jefferson looked back on the Declaration as something tied not only to America, but to the fate of the entire world. He remembered that the choice they had made 50 years earlier, as a choice between submission and the sword, he took comfort in the fact that after half of a century, the American people still approved of the choice that they made. And then Jefferson wrote that the annual return of this day should forever refresh our recollection of our rights and our devotion to them. That is what Independence Day meant to Jefferson at the end of his life. Not just celebration, recollection, devotion, and memory. A people remembering the rights for which independence had been declared. And Adams had seen it too. Back in 1776, right after independence was voted, Adams wrote to Abigail that the day would be celebrated by future generations with devotion, parades, games, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. He saw the celebration before the celebration even existed. But he also saw the cost. In that same letter, Adams wrote that he was well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it would cost to maintain the Declaration and defend the states. Adams knew independence would not be cheap. And 50 years later, on July 4th, 1826, the old man was still alive as the nation celebrated the anniversary of what he and Jefferson had helped create. Then, in one of the most remarkable moments in American history, Thomas Jefferson died in Virginia, and a few hours later, John Adams had died in Massachusetts. Two men, two founders, two presidents, two signers connected forever to the Declaration, both dying on the 50th anniversary of American independence. Adams' last words, not knowing that Jefferson had already passed, were, "Jefferson survives." Unfortunately, as I just mentioned, Jefferson had died only a few hours later. And now 250 years after independence, the question is not whether our nation will survive. The question is whether the principles they fought for still survive in us. Do we remember what this day means? Do we understand what was declared? Do we still have the courage to preserve what they gave us? Because if Jefferson believed the annual return of Independence Day should refresh our memories of our rights, then this 250th anniversary should do even more. It should wake us up. It should humble us. It should remind us that this country was not created by comfort. And if Adams could see the toil, the blood, and the treasure that independence would cost, then we should be willing to see the duty that independence still requires. The founders gave us a nation. They gave us a republic. They gave us an inheritance. They did not guarantee that liberty would preserve itself. They warned us that it would disappear if we do not defend it ourselves. And that is where I want to leave this episode, because I love this country. And I believe this country is still worth fighting for, still worth defending, still worth teaching our children to love, and still worth preserving. But if we are going to honor Independence Day correctly, then we have to remember what it actually is. It is the birthday of a nation that was born through courage, sacrifice, suffering, and faith. And 250 years later, the responsibility to preserve our republic and liberties belongs to us. So today, I hope you can celebrate. I would like to wish everyone a happy 250th birthday to the United States of America. And to everyone listening, I hope you have a happy, fun, and safe 4th of July. God bless you all. God bless our republic. And God bless the United States of America. Thank you.